This is one of the most famous photographs of General George Custer. We know it was one of his favorites. A copy of it hung in the man's living room. Let me ask you something. How old do you think the guy in this photograph is? Well, he's 25. Today he'd still be on his parents' health insurance, but by the end of the Civil War, General Custer was a major general and a bit of a media darling. Stick around, I'll show you my favorite photograph of the man, and I'll explain why it's my favorite. Since his death at the Little Bighorn, it's hard to think of another person whose legacy has done a 180 like Custer's. Early on, right after his death, he was seen as a hero who sacrificed himself for the good of American progress. Nowadays, well, perspectives have changed.
I think that the story emerges as Custer as this hero, but over time, I think historians, uncovered there were some big flaws that were made in that whole campaign, and we shouldn't hold him on as high of a pedestal as we have.
So when we think about Custer's Last Stand or the Battle of the Little Bighorn or whatever we want to call it, we should think of it as a successful defense by Native people against an attempted act of genocide.
So let's talk about Custer's legacy, and to do that, we're going to use that most American of media types, the movies. Now, I should probably mention that none of the movies we're going to talk about today are historically accurate, but that's not the point. We're looking at the themes that each of these movies is trying to convey. With each of these movies, context is important. Remember, in the early 20th century, Custer himself was still in living memory. Custer's widow Elizabeth lived until 1933, and most people felt it was bad manners to criticize a man who had died in service of his country. By 1941, America was preparing for war. With Hitler steamrolling through Europe and the Japanese controlling the Far East, it was becoming obvious that America's involvement in World War II was inevitable. The country's first ever peacetime draft had started in 1940, and by 1941, American culture was becoming measurably more military friendly. I mean, we are trying to motivate a generation of men to kill Nazis here. Bob Hope and Abbott and Costello starred in comedies about Army life, while the Andrews sisters wore uniforms in their performances and sang about Boogie Woogie Bugle Boys. 4 of the year's top 10 movies were war or Army themed, and 2 of those were biopics. Sergeant York, about the guy who went absolute ham on some Germans in World War I, and They Died with Their Boots On, a biopic about George Custer. And what Hollywood actor are you going to get to play George Custer? How about Mr. Robin Hood himself, Errol friggin' Flynn? They Died with Their Boots On traces Custer's career from West Point through the Civil War and onto the Great Plains. Throughout the movie, there's no question of Custer's heroism. He's leading cavalry charges, getting into fights, real man stuff. But if you've never seen this movie, you might be surprised at who the movie's antagonist is. It isn't really Crazy Horse, played in a handful of scenes by Anthony Quinn. No, the real bad guys are the corrupt businessmen that Custer refuses to have anything to do with. Flynn's Custer never hesitates to stand up for what he believes is right, no matter who it's against.
As you were, G-Troop. I'm in command here, Custer, just as long as I can stand. That suits me.
Yeah, get him! Now, is any of it true? Well, after West Point, and we will get to West Point, Custer found himself on the staffs of several generals who all praised his performance. See Abraham Lincoln meeting with George McClellan, the commander of the Army of the Potomac? Well, there's Custer standing off to the side. Leading attacks? Custer did that. Scouting for the enemy? Custer did that. The Civil War saw the first major use of hot air balloons in war. Custer did that too. He was one of a handful of officers who volunteered to go up in hot air balloons to report Confederate movements. Custer was also just a popular guy. If you were Custer's friend, he would do everything he could to hook you up. This 1862 photograph shows Lieutenant Custer with Lieutenant James Washington, one of Custer's West Point friends. Lieutenant Washington dropped out of West Point, joined the Confederacy, and had just been captured by the Union Army. Custer made sure his friend was well taken care of while he was in captivity. This photo was taken as part of a series and displayed in London as an exhibition to show the Brits the cause behind the Civil War. Now, the history guy has done a whole video about how Custer was best man at another Confederate friend's wedding. I'll link to that video here. Critics of Custer's military career never accuse him of cowardice, quite the opposite. Instead, he was accused of being almost too brave to the point of recklessness. Custer was also well known for his physical stamina. The guy pushed himself hard and expected the people around him to keep up. By the middle of 1863, the Union cavalry was in the middle of a transition. The Army needed aggressive commanders who weren't afraid to make decisions and fight. Custer was one of those men. A few days before the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863, Custer was promoted from captain to brigadier general and placed in command of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade at 23 years old. During the Battle of Gettysburg, Custer's brigade, along with other Federal cavalry, protected the rear of the Union Army against Confederate cavalry. Despite being massively outnumbered, Custer personally led multiple charges against the Confederates, at one point yelling to his soldiers, "I kid you not, "Come on, you Wolverines."
Wolverines!
The next year, the Union cavalry was reorganized, and Custer was promoted to Major General, one of General Philip Sheridan's division commanders. Sheridan became Custer's mentor, and under his guidance, Custer would become one of the Union's most famous cavalry leaders. It was one of Custer's troopers that shot and mortally wounded Confederate legend Jeb Stuart at Yellow Tavern. Custer's name is all over battle maps from 1864. 3rd Winchester, Cedar Creek, Trevilian Station,
Chickamauga, Okefenokee, Sarsaparilla Creek, Battle of Olive Garden, that been in the mall.
Custer's reputation was large enough he was now getting noticed in the papers. It also meant he had gained enough social clout to marry Elizabeth Bacon, the daughter of a prominent Michigan judge. Not bad, considering George was the son of a blacksmith. The pinnacle of Custer's career were the days in April 1865 when General Robert E. Lee's army broke out of their trenches around Richmond. The pursuit was on, and Custer's division was at the front of the fighting. For days, Custer's men whittled away at the Confederate army non-stop. According to Custer's official report, in 10 days, his division had captured 46 cannons and 37 Confederate battle flags. By the morning of April 9th, Custer had gotten in front of Lee and cut off his last escape route. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses Grant that afternoon. After the surrender, General Sheridan came out of the house holding the table Grant had written the surrender terms on. He gifted it to Custer's wife, along with a note that concluded, "Permit me to say, madam, that there is scarcely an individual in our service who has contributed more to bring about this desirable result than your gallant husband." And that brings me to my favorite Custer photograph. It's not this one where he's bagging the elk, or this one where he's bagging the grizzly. This one's kind of cool. Kind of a cool effect there. But no, that ain't it either. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what that's all about. Here, check out this one. This one's part of a series. On or about April 12, 1865, Custer and his wife posed for a series of photographs in Richmond. These were the happy few days between Lee's surrender on April 9th and Lincoln's assassination on the 14th. That gal on the left is Eliza, a teenage escaped slave who worked as the Custer's cook. Libby's wearing a dress that mimics the sleeve braids that Custer liked on his custom jackets, but check out Custer. See those sunken cheeks and those eyes? If he looks like a dude that's been shot at in half a dozen battles in the last week, that's because he was. Now fast forward a generation and America's cultural landscape has changed. George Custer would again be featured as a character in a Western, but things would be quite a bit different this time around. 1970's Little Big Man tells the story of Jack Crabb, the world's oldest man and sole white survivor of Custer's last stand. Throughout the movie, Jack drifts through various segments of Western society: gunfighter, town citizen, Indian, drunk. At several points, he crosses paths with George Custer, commander of the 7th Cavalry and portrayed by Richard Mulligan. By the 60s and 70s, American culture was changing, and movies of the time document this shift. Little Big Man is part of a movement known as Western revisionism. It basically takes the formulaic Westerns that were mainstays of early American cinema and says, life is a little bit more complicated than that. Sometimes, good guys don't wear white. And a major criticism leveled by revisionist Westerns was the treatment natives had gotten in early Western storylines. Native treatment was big news. This was around the time when Marlon Brando sent a native gal to decline his Academy Award for Best Actor as a protest against Hollywood's treatment of natives. My mom remembers when natives took over and occupied Mount Rushmore when she was a kid. With all that going on, you may expect Hollywood's depiction of Custer to go in a different direction, and you'd be right.
I knowed General George Armstrong Custer for what he was. And I also knowed the Indians for what they was.
In Little Big Man, Custer is self-centered, aloof, and unconcerned with the welfare of his soldiers.
You're not going to hang me.
Your miserable life is not worth a reversal of a Custer decision.
His multiple mistakes in judgment lead to Last Stand Hill, where he has a full-on psychotic break with reality.
Mr. President, you're drunk. We can't have a man like you in the White House.
You can tell the movie's tone by the way it uses one of Custer's favorite songs, Gary Owen. In They Died with Their Boots On, Gary Owen is the motivational anthem that propels Custer's men to victory. In Little Big Man, the same song hits with a sense of dread. In Little Big Man, Custer isn't just self-serving. is evil. So how much of this is grounded in reality? Well, take a look at this. This is the Grand Review, basically a giant parade for the entire Union Army in Washington, D.C. after the war was over. Custer rode in the parade on top of a beautiful horse named Don Juan, and wouldn't you know it, right in front of the reviewing stand, the horse bolted with Custer on it. Of course, Custer was able to gain control of the horse and everyone cheered. I'll leave it up to you if you think he was showing off or not. But that horse, well, due to overriding military necessity, Custer was forced to commandeer. He stole it. He stole it and rode it in a parade. Custer cut the horse and planned on selling it for a profit, even when General Grant himself wanted the horse returned. Don Juan ended up dying shortly after, which made the whole thing a moot point. Rank has its privileges, and Custer definitely exercised his, but the Army changed after the war. Custer had trouble adapting. During the war, Custer had been promoted from captain to general, like going from a shift manager straight to vice president. And while that was cool, it also meant he didn't have a lot of experience leading at those middle management levels. He was used to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. And that worked during the war, when you had tens of thousands of men who were willing to sacrifice for the good of the country. But after the war, those men left the Army to go back to civilian life. The Army was left with men who either wouldn't or couldn't do anything else for a living. During the war, Custer's energy and endurance was legendary. He could spend days in the saddle if need be, and expected his men to do the same. Which was fine when fighting the Rebs, but now it just pissed off his soldiers on the frontier. During the war, Custer had been nicknamed the Boy General. Now to his troops, he was known as Hard Ass. And that brings us to 1867, when Custer led the 7th Cavalry during an expedition against hostile natives on the Southern Plains. Custer marched his men for days across modern-day Kansas and Nebraska, but the native warriors didn't stand and fight like the Confederates had. It was a frustrating campaign, and for the enlisted men, that usually meant deserting, which the Army takes very seriously and you aren't allowed to do. But you're also not allowed to shoot deserters without trial. You definitely aren't allowed to shoot at deserters and then deny them medical treatment if they survive. And after shooting deserters, you really shouldn't take a bunch of your friends and just leave the rest of your soldiers in the field during a military campaign so you can go visit your old lady. Custer did all that and was arrested. He defended his actions by saying he left his command to go get supplies for his men, but the Army didn't buy it. He was court-martialed for being AWOL and for conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, found guilty of all charges, and suspended from the Army for 1 year without pay. The way Custer later phrased it, he was placed in temporary retirement from active duty. However, remember General Sheridan, Custer's mentor? Well, he was planning a winter campaign against the Southern hostiles and was able to get Custer unsuspended early so he could lead it. Custer scored the main success of Sheridan's 1868 campaign when he attacked Black Kettle's village on the Washita River. Now, I don't have time to cover the battle in this video. Let me know in the comments section if you'd be interested in me doing a deep dive into that. But there's one part of the battle that's relevant to our discussion, and that involves Custer's second-in-command, Major Joel Elliott. Major Elliott was a Civil War veteran and was popular in the 7th Cavalry. At the Washita, Major Elliott saw a group of Cheyenne escaping and led 19 soldiers after them. As Custer was mopping up the village and killing the pony herd, he learned of a large village nearby and a superior number of warriors who were assembling to surround him. Custer knew he had to pull out, but Major Elliott was nowhere to be found. In Custer's account of the battle, he wrote, "He, too, had evidently been killed, but as yet we knew not where or how he had fallen." During the night, the 7th Cavalry was able to evade the warriors, but Major Elliott and his men wouldn't be found until the next month. And what they found wasn't pretty. The soldiers' hacked-up bodies were found in a circle, with dozens of spent shell casings around them. Now, for a good controversy to take hold, there needs to be an element of ambiguity, and Major Elliott's fate at the Washita perfectly illustrates this. It's debated to this day. Now, Custer defended his actions by saying if he had stuck around trying to find Elliott, his whole force might have been wiped out, which is fair enough. But the optics aren't great. It looks like you just left your men behind to die. And that doesn't exactly instill confidence in your soldiers that you won't do the same thing to them later on. Custer's officers were split on the issue, and as we've seen, Custer wasn't the best at mending fences and building consensus. The division in the 7th Cavalry officers' attitudes towards Custer would split the regiment until Custer's dying day. And that brings us to our postmodern 21st century time frame. What do you call things nowadays? Post-ironic? Case in point, 2009's Night at the Museum, Battle of the Smithsonian, featuring Bill Hader as George Custer. Now, I get it, this is a kid's movie, or at least a popcorn comedy, but I'm not going to let it off the hook that easily. because even lightweight movies like this have the ability to influence our perception of people, places, and events. And for a lot of people today, their first encounter with George Custer was in this movie as, well, an idiot, a punchline.
But won't yelling attack alert the enemy that we are about to attack?
So, was Custer a moron? Exhibit A, his West Point record. Told you we'd get to that. Custer was originally supposed to graduate in 1862, but with the Civil War breaking out, the Army needed officers, and Custer's class was accelerated. And with a large segment of the Southern cadets seceding to join the Confederate Army, only 34 cadets were left in Custer's class, with Custer ranking dead last. In fact, George Custer is widely regarded as being one of, if not the, worst cadet to ever graduate from West Point. Custer himself wrote, "My career as a cadet had but little to recommend it to the study of those who came after me, unless as an example to be carefully avoided." It's no secret Custer sucked at West Point, but it's been played by his supporters as a virtue, a badge of honor. We don't need no book learning to win wars. Generally on the battlefield, Custer made the right call. He wouldn't have been as popular if he hadn't. His worst day as a field commander probably came during the Battle of Trevilian Station in June 1864. While advancing, Custer couldn't resist an opportunity to capture a rebel supply train and a number of prisoners. But the attack left him and his men dangerously surrounded by Confederate troops, who relentlessly attacked Custer's troopers for hours. Sheridan had to send additional brigades to support Custer's brigade, who eventually made it out, although his personal wagon was captured. There's also this. A few months after marrying Libby, George shaved his mustache off and mailed it to her. It's, weird. Custer wasn't stupid. If he had been, he would have been found out and fired. But he does display a kind of youthful naivete in his decision-making. For example, remember the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, Custer's high watermark? Well, General James Longstreet, the Confederate general in charge of the troops facing Custer, wrote the following recollection in his memoirs. After delivering the message, Captain Sims, through some informality, was sent to call the truce. The firing ceased. General Custer rode to Captain Sims to know his authority, and upon finding that he was of my staff, asked to be conducted to my headquarters, and down they came in fast gallop, General Custer's flaxen locks flowing over his shoulders, and in brusque, excited manner he said, "In the name of General Sheridan, I demand the unconditional surrender of this army." He was reminded that I was not the commander of the army, that he was within the lines of the enemy without authority, addressing a superior officer, and in disrespect to General Grant as well as myself. That if I was the commander of the army, I would not receive the message of General Sheridan. He then became more moderate, saying it would be a pity to have more blood upon that field. Then I suggested that the truce be respected, and said, "As you are now more reasonable, I will say that General Lee has gone to meet General Grant, and it is for them to determine the future of the armies." He was satisfied, and rode back to his command. Custer's youth and impulsivity were front row center again the next year, during the Swing Around the Circle, which was basically a speaking tour for President Andrew Johnson to shore up support for his Reconstruction policies. It was a PR disaster, with the president's speeches often devolving into shouting matches with the crowd. Custer was invited, along with members of Johnson's cabinet and Union heroes like General Grant and Admiral David Farragut. But while those more seasoned and mature men kept their mouths shut, Custer couldn't help himself. More than once he got into it with hecklers. At a train stop near his birthplace, Custer told the hostile crowd, "I was born 2 miles from here, and I am ashamed of you all." And more than a decade later, as his regiment was preparing to go to war with the hostile Lakota and Cheyenne tribes, Custer inserted himself into congressional hearings targeting graft at military trading posts. Now, I'm always down for getting rid of crooked bureaucrats, but Custer's testimony did nothing, was almost certainly politically motivated, and almost cost him his career. I've done a whole video about that situation. You can find that here. Now, I can't wait to hear your opinion. Do you think Custer was a hero, a psycho, or a moron, or some type of combination of those? Let's continue the discussion down in the comments. If there's enough interest, maybe I'll do a follow-up video. I'd also appreciate it if you click the like button and subscribe to this channel too. Now check out some of these other videos that I'm sure you'll find interesting. Thanks for watching.